We've all seen dead people in movies come to their senses at their own funeral or in the morgue. But did you know that this can happen in real life? Today you'll learn about it. It's Infinity, and in this episode I'll tell you about 10 people who woke up at their own funeral. Brighton Dama Zanth. It's difficult to imagine what people feel when they see a dead person literally come back to life at his own funeral. This is exactly the experience that the residents of the city of Gweru in Zimbabwe had a few years ago. A 34-year-old man named Brighton Dama Zanth was pronounced dead by doctors. The cause of death was said to be a lingering illness that had killed the man. Brighton's funeral was arranged. As people gathered around his coffin and began to pay their respects, they noticed that Brighton was moving. The mourners were speechless and scattered in fear, thinking that Mr. Zanth had risen from the dead like a zombie to begin hunting them down. But when they calmed down and recovered from the shock, they realized what had happened. The doctors had made a mistake. Relatives immediately took Brighton to a local hospital where he was hooked up to an artificial life support machine. Amazingly, just 2 days later, Brighton was discharged and sent home. I think the zombies should be afraid of such a resilient guy. Figiliu Mukametsinov. About 10 years ago, a 49-year-old woman named Figiliu Mukametsinov became world famous when she woke up at her own funeral. Doctors mistakenly diagnosed her death, after which the relatives began to prepare for the funeral ceremony. On the day of the funeral, Figiliu was taken to the cemetery, where grieving relatives gathered around her coffin, praying for her and remembering her with kind words. To their surprise and shock, Figiliu woke up in her own coffin and started screaming. The woman immediately realized where she was and panicked that she'd be buried alive. This didn't happen. The woman was immediately taken back to the hospital, but the rejoicing didn't last long. Unfortunately, the experience of her own funeral was incredibly shocking and devastating for Figiliu, so the woman's heart failed, and 12 minutes after her miraculous awakening, she died. Figiliu's relatives were furious at the doctors because they believed that had the doctors not been wrong the first time, Figiliu would still be alive and her heart would have been fine, because she wouldn't have had to go through such a traumatic experience. Hirpa Negero. Hirpa Negero, a resident of Ethiopia, was seriously ill, so the man's death came as no surprise to his family and doctors. At the funeral, Hirpa's family and friends were saying goodbye to him when suddenly they heard a knocking sound from the coffin. Many of the guests at the funeral ceremony scattered in terror, but the bravest ones opened the coffin and rescued the man, who appeared to have woken up hours earlier but was so weak he couldn't even scream. The funeral ceremony immediately turned into a resurrection celebration. As the experts suggested, Negero was in a coma, which the doctors failed to recognize. He was very lucky to wake up in time. Although the incident was an amazing one, unfortunately, Negero didn't live that long. 2 months after his miraculous resurrection, the Ethiopian passed away. 55 years old Malik worked as a shepherd in Odisha, a state in eastern India. One day he didn't return home from grazing. They searched for him in the places where he usually walked with his goats. When Malik was found, he was unconscious. The residents believed that the man had died. They dug a grave and organized a funeral. At the funeral ceremony, one man noticed that Malik shook his head faintly. Soon, Malik woke up and started swearing at the funeral directors. The ceremony was immediately interrupted. Malik was taken out of the grave to the cheers of the crowd and taken to the hospital. There, the doctors determined that Malik had come down with a high fever. It was because of this that he lost consciousness and looked as if he had died. Sometimes people wake up right at their funerals, and sometimes they're resurrected before it even comes to the funeral ceremony. Stay tuned and you'll learn about such stories. Li Junfeng. Imagine a man walks into his kitchen and sees his recently deceased grandmother cooking dinner. How shocked would that person be? I think he'd probably be on the verge of a heart attack, because this is a scenario worthy of some horror movie. And this is exactly the kind of scenario that happened in China. Li Zhufeng, a 95-year-old Chinese woman, climbed out of her coffin 6 days after she was found supposedly dead in her room. Her family members thought that Zhufeng had suffered a fatal head injury. It was clear to them that Grandma was already beyond the veil, so they began planning her funeral, including holding a wake at her home for friends and family. Fortunately, her coffin was not nailed shut in time, which gave Zhufeng an opportunity to get out of the coffin. The day before the funeral, friends and family came to her house and found an empty coffin from which the body had disappeared. Shocked, they went looking for the body and found Zhufeng sitting in a chair in her kitchen, cooking a meal. As Zhufeng said, "I slept for a long time. After waking up, I felt so hungry and wanted to cook something to eat. Not a bad answer for relatives who have already come to terms with the loss. Subsequently, the doctor examined Grandma and concluded that what had happened to her had been an artificial death. Her family members, on the other hand, described Grandma's case more simply as the reason they all crapped themselves. Well, it's understandable. Lyudmila Striblakya. The case of Lyudmila Striblakya is unique because this woman from Russia frightened everyone with her return from the beyond twice. In 2011, Lyudmila was taken to the regional clinic hospital in Tomsk, where she spent several days because she wasn't feeling well. After some time, Lyudmila's daughter, Anastasia, called the hospital to inquire about her mother's condition, and the doctors informed her that her mother had died. Heartbroken, Anastasia began planning her mother's funeral and calling her family and friends with the sad news. But as it turned out, Anastasia rushed to judgment. When she went to the morgue to pick up the body, she saw her mother calling her name. Lyudmila not only managed to cheat death, but she managed to last the entire 3 days lying in the cold morgue. She was very happy to be alive and be able to see her friends and family. But it didn't end there. In 2012, Lyudmila, who had a long history of heart problems, was in the hospital, where doctors pronounced her dead again. This time they were wrong too. The woman regained consciousness hours later. After the second incident, the internet users began to refer to the woman as the immortal Grandma Lucia. Tony Yale. Ohio mechanic Tony Yale was taken to the hospital the morning of August 4, 2013, after his wife noticed his breathing sounded odd. He remained in stable condition for several hours until late in the evening when his heart suddenly stopped beating. Doctors' attempts to revive Yale were unsuccessful, and after 45 minutes they pronounced him dead. Refusing to acknowledge the news, Tony Yale's 17-year-old son, named Lawrence, burst through the hospital corridor into the ward and shouted, "Dad, you're not going to die today." Coincidence or not, within moments, Yale began to show signs of life. After recovering from their surprise, the doctors realized there was no time to lose and resumed resuscitation procedures. The mechanic finally rose from the dead a few minutes later. The heart of the resurrected Tony looked absolutely healthy according to all parameters. For several days, Tony was thoroughly examined, and then he was discharged and sent home. Just a week after the incident, the man went to work. He's like Iron Man or Terminator, isn't he? In 2007, Carlos Cameo, a Venezuelan, was taken to the morgue after a serious car accident. When doctors arrived on the scene of the accident, they found that the man had died of his injuries. The pathologists were about to begin an autopsy when suddenly blood came out of a cut on Carlos's face. The doctors began stitching the wound when suddenly Carlos woke up, opened his eye, and even tried to get up. The doctors mistakenly stated that he had died while Carlos had been unconscious the whole time. Fortunately, everything turned out all right. Cameo recovered from the incident and his injuries fairly quickly. As a reminder of the incident, he was left with a certificate of his own death, which he's happy to show to journalists. Miss Celestrino. 60 years old Miss Celestrino spent 2 hours wrapped in a plastic bag and placed in a morgue. She was placed there after doctors mistakenly thought she died of a lung infection at a hospital in Brazil. Her daughter, Rosangela Celestrino, went to the morgue to hug her mother for the last time and felt that she was still breathing. The doctors thought Rosangela was joking when she screamed that her mother was still alive. However, when they later examined the body, they concluded that the old lady was, in fact, still alive. She was immediately taken from the morgue and hooked up to an artificial life support machine in the hospital's intensive care unit. And finally, an unusual episode that took place in 2019 in Ireland at the funeral of Irish Army veteran Shay Bradley. Relatives of Shay had gathered at the ceremony to bid him farewell. Suddenly, they heard a knock and a voice from the coffin. "Hello? Hello? Hello? Let me out! Where am I? Let me out! It's dark in here! Let me out! I can hear you! Is that the priest I can hear?" Unexpected, isn't it? The mood of guests immediately changed. They started smiling and laughing. This episode differs from the previous ones in that Shay did not wake up at the funeral. As it turned out, the veteran knew that he was dying, so he recorded such a message to lift the spirits of those present on the day of mourning. He finished the message by saying, "I just called to say goodbye." In my opinion, it was a great prank. Which story from this episode impressed you the most? Let me know in the comments section down below. Thank you for watching and see you later.